want a king!
Said the Israelites to Samuel, and in the way that I reasoned when I was 10, they argued,
All the other nations have kings. Why can't we have a king?
Now Samuel was close to God, and he knew the dangers of the Israelites having a king. As God himself had said, this means they have rejected me as king. What surprises me most about this ancient story is the way in which God is willing to compromise. He knows that a king isn't best for his people, yet he's willing to listen to them. He meets them where they're at in their foolishness and selfish demands, and by the end of the chapter he said to Samuel, listen to the people and give them a king. And it seems that we live in a post-Samuel world today. We live in a world of kings, whether they're elected heads of state or chief execs of city banks or Rupert Murdoch. And it's easy to forget that our politics is a compromise. We were made to be ruled by God. We're citizens of heaven, and yet we live in a world governed by men. We're going back to the Old Testament. God didn't abandon his people when they rejected his kingship. Instead, he put in place prophets. And so there were kings and prophets. The kings who had their own agendas, fought their own wars, and grew rich while their subjects were poor. And there were prophets, lonely yet persistent voices which spoke out against what the kings were doing. The prophets who preached justice, who stood up for the poor and the oppressed, who proclaimed freedom for the captives. The prophets who were rejected by the rulers and often stoned to death. Not so long ago, millions of African men, women and children were crammed into British ships and trafficked across the Atlantic, suffocating in the heat and stench of human waste and seasickness. They arrived in our ports and were branded so as to mark that they no longer belonged to God, but to a man. To the British electorate, that's us, 200 years ago, the slave trade was just one of those unfortunate but ultimately unchangeable realities. It was normal in the same way that indebted single mums, homelessness and sweatshop workers might seem normal to us today. No one really challenged it. Yet there was a small but persistent voice, a few fanatics, crazy Methodists who demanded abolition, and they were laughed at, they were scoffed at in Parliament. The kings, the bishops and the press all mocked them with false theology and economics. Then they were hated, shouted down and abused. But 26 years later, they won. The trade was abolished and the rest is history. And all it took was William Wilberforce, a group of crazy evangelical friends, and a radical belief in God. And that's what we're called to, isn't it? To be prophets, to stand up for those whom the world forgets. Proverbs 31 says to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who need an advocate. We can choose to serve kings, to serve the economic and political forces in this world, or we can be prophets, advocates who proclaim freedom for the captives.